Welcome to Dark Dreams.
Horrified Press. horrifiedpress.wordpress.com.
The moon is full and it is dripping with blood.
Now comes Blood Moon Rising magazine.
Original fiction,
Creature features,
nightmarish artwork.
interviews, and other original horror.
Visit bloodmoonrisingmagazine.com and join our rising legion.
Good evening. Welcome tonight to Dark Dreams Podcast for Friday, October 18th, 2013. I am your host, Jason Gehlert. We have a nice lineup tonight of stories, all which will be read and narrated by E.S. Wynn. First up is Blip Hunter by J. Noyes Scher, filmmaker from New York. It's a story that ran in the Twilight Zone magazine back in 1988, so we're very excited to hear about this story. We also have Last of the Ogres by Gavin Chappell, who is also the editor of Schlock Bi-Monthly magazine. I also have an interview in Schlock Bi-Monthly magazine that is currently available for sale on Amazon and other outlets. And my novel, Contagion, a military zombie novel, is also available for sale through Horrified Press, through Lulu, Nook, and other outlets for sale. So check all that out. We have an excellent show tonight, so let's get started. First up, Blip Hunter, read by E.S. Wynn.
Blimp Hunter by J. Noyes Scher. Shelby Holcomb wasn't sure what it was about blimps that he hated. He wasn't even sure he hated them. It was just that hunting them seemed to satisfy some sort of primal urge. Like a sport or hobby, it was an activity to lose himself in, an escape from the pressures of the day-to-day, considerable as they were in a city the scale of Manhattan. Sure, some people build ships in bottles, some collect stamps, but Shelby was most content seated atop the roof of the 40-story clock tower in Tribeca, a go bag at his side and his rifle in his lap. He used a .22 with the rationalization that the tiny bullets didn't make much more than pigeon-peck-sized holes in the blimps, and he never aimed at the manned gondola that hung from the blimp's belly. He had nothing against the pilots or crews. If anything, he envied their view. He might have made a case for shooting at the advertisements that blinked across the blimps, but it wouldn't have explained anything. It was really just sport, something to shoot at that didn't shoot back, something to do at night outdoors in the city that didn't cost an arm and a leg. He would have felt bad if he'd ever actually shot one down. For starters, it would have meant the end of his hobby. People who lived out in the country had it made, he thought. They could shoot as much as they liked and not have to worry about hitting anyone. But in a city crammed with 8 million people, there was only one direction to shoot with any degree of safety, and that direction was up. When Shelby first moved to the city, he tried shooting at rats in the park at night, but the rifle was too big to conceal, and handguns didn't have the same appeal. He'd thought about pigeons, but they weren't good sport and tended to roost in places he didn't dare risk shooting at, like windowsills. Blimps, on the other hand, were perfect. He could aim for the bulbs that lit up their sides as they spelled out the various ads and greetings. It was difficult to hit them, and it was difficult to tell when he'd hit them, as the words danced across the blimp, blinking from one row of bulbs to the next, but it didn't matter. It was the hunt itself that gratified. And so it was, one hot Friday night in July, that Shelby climbed out of the trap door and onto the clock tower roof. Off on the Jersey side of the island, the sun was setting with atomic colors, while on the east side above him the sky was a deep blue. Stars were just visible, and a slight breeze up on the tower made it almost chilly. Shelby was glad he'd worn his hunting jacket. He walked to the edge of the building and sat down between the large roof ornaments in front of the big clock. He cracked the pop-top on a rolling rock and scanned the sky. There were 2 blimps out that night. One drifted off Battery Park, probably over the Statue of Liberty. The other was up around Midtown. Shelby was prepared to lie in wait, like any hunter of big game. Sooner or later, a blimp would float past. They almost always did, and when one did, he'd be ready. Shelby let his thoughts drift unfettered. Images came to mind. He saw his mother bending over an open oven, and laughed to himself. It was a funny way to think of her, as she almost never cooked. Then he recalled Jack Axtinger, his antagonistic, rotund boss at the bakery. There was a lot of blimp in him, he thought. To erase these relatively unpleasant images from his mind, he did what he often did. He put women he'd glimpsed in the streets into the roles of women in various religious films he'd seen, and played his favorite scenes over and over in his mind, making little improvements, and imagining what kind of shoes they would wear. Shelby dissolved from his fantasies back to the skyline. The downtown blimp was slowly making its way uptown. An errant breeze carried the whirring drone of the blimp motors to him. Shelby felt his adrenaline rise as he put his beer aside and grabbed his rifle. He hugged the wooden buttstock to his cheek and inhaled the sweet scent of the lemon oil polish. He watched through the telescopic sight as the big gas bag cleared the Woolworth building and drifted toward him. He held his breath and squeezed off one shot. Pop! Off it flew. He ejected the shell, focused his being through the sight, and fired again. He fired a half-dozen shots, lost in his task. The blimp had never come this close to the clock tower before. He could see the sign lamps clearly, and he picked off one after another. As the blimp drew nearer still, he could almost hear the pop of the bulbs. The blimp motors were now clearly audible, and growing louder as Shelby continued to shoot. Slowly, the bulbs on the blimp grew in size till they filled the circle in Shelby's telescopic sight. It was only then that Shelby looked up with his naked eye, astonished to see just how close the blimp had come. Shelby put his rifle down. Hell, he thought, it almost isn't fair to shoot when it's this close. He felt suddenly exposed as the blimp came around to face him. The lights in the gondola seemed to glare at him like big, unblinking, angry eyes. It was so close now that he could clearly make out the mooring line and the black ribbing of the nose-cone batons, and yet it was still coming. They'd better pull up or turn off, he said to himself, or they're going to hit something. But on it came, and Shelby suddenly panicked. He put his rifle aside and gasped. It was coming right at him, and it somehow seemed angry. Shelby leapt to his feet and turned to beat a hasty retreat, only to discover that the second blimp had snuck up behind and was now hovering, huge with menace, its motors growling, filling the entire northern skyline with its huge mass. Shelby threw himself at the trap door in the roof and yanked it open. He leapt in just as the first blimp roared overhead. He clambered down the rungs of the ladder, closed the trap door, and tried to catch his breath. He listened for the blimps over the ticking of the big antique clock. When his heart slowed down to normal, he realized he'd left his rifle on the roof. He debated the wisdom of retrieving it, and found himself laughing. It was absurd, just some freak winds, no doubt. They weren't wild beasts. They were blimps. He went back up the ladder and opened the trap door. Cautiously, he stuck his head out. When he saw both blimps lying in wait for him, He changed his mind and shut the trapdoor quickly. To hell with the rifle, he thought. They were angry. Shelby descended the ladder to the top of the circular stairwell that ran down the inside of the clock tower. Through the tall, dirty windows he could see the blimps. They were circling and building like gigantic sharks. They were after him. Shelby took the elevator down to the ground floor and made for the Broadway exit. He left the building quickly and walked 4 blocks north before he dared look up. Sure enough, the 2 blimps were still circling the clock tower. Shelby laughed. They might be big, and they might be mean, but they sure were stupid, he thought. He turned and walked off down the block, unaware that the 2 blimps had left the building and were now motoring slowly after him. The Last of the Ogres by Gavin Chappell. The ogre loomed above him, bellowing angrily, its long matted hair lashing about its huge head, its claws and tusks glimmering in the sickly light of the moon. Swiftly the knight turned to the slab, brought his axe slamming down on the chains that restrained the girl. The ring of steel on steel echoed back from the trees, a sharp, clear note above the basso rumbling of the ogre. The broken fetters fell to the hard earth. "Quick!" he screamed at the girl. "Run!" She gave him a horrified, fearful glance and fled towards the distant trees. The knight saw no more of her flight as he brought his shield up to deflect the ogre's ham-like fist. The shield broke with a hollow crack and fell from his numbed arm. A stench emanated from the ogre's hairy body as it swung another blow at him. He hacked at the creature with his axe, at the horrible, terrible presence of the ogre. Fear had rushed through his body like a cold wave, but now he was fighting, following his training. He felt strangely calm as the ogre roared in fury, seized a huge boulder from the ground and lifted it to bring it crushing down on the knight. Rather than flee, the knight charged under the ogre's guard, gouging its flesh with a swing of his axe. The monster roared in pain and dropped the boulder, which slammed down on the turf. The knight danced to one side, chainmail jingling. The ogre clutched at its gut, peering down in anger, then lashed out at him with a backward swing of its right arm. Lights seemed to explode within the knight's head, and he found himself flying through the air. He landed with a heavy thud that knocked the breath from his lungs, leaving him wheezing painfully. Unable to move, he lay still. A shriek roused him, and he lifted his head painfully. He saw the ogre rushing towards the girl, who had just reached the edge of the trees. She stared in fear over her shoulder as the ogre pursued her. Fire seemed to rush through the knight's frame as he forced his aching body to rise. His axe lay on the sward nearby, and he snatched it up. The ogre bore down on the fleeing girl. The knight lifted his axe, aimed it at the ogre's neck, and threw it. It flashed in the moonlight like midnight lightning, whirred across the clearing to sink into the ogre's dark bulk. The monster threw up its mighty arms, bellowed mournfully, and collapsed at the foot of an oak. The knight glimpsed the pale shape of the girl as she ran heedlessly into the woods. Wheezing, he limped forward, weak and shivering, weighed down by his armor. The ogre lay struggling vainly on the grass. Then it was still. The knight stared down at its corpse. He called into the trees, "Come back! It's dead!" He heard nothing but silence and hoped she was not out of earshot. He had rescued the girl. She could show some consideration. How could he ever win a reputation as the finest knight in all of Christendom if the girl he rescued didn't even know he had done it? Then her pale face bobbed into sight, and she approached the clearing cautiously. She was stiff with fear. Her ordeal of terror had been worse than his own struggle. He wrenched the axe from the ogre's flesh, and she shuddered. With a rough laugh, he put his arm around her shoulders. "It's over now," he said simply. "We can go back." That night, there was rejoicing throughout the girl's village as her father and her family and all her folk celebrated her unanticipated liberation. They had thought they had seen their last sight of her when they chained her to the sacrificial rock in the ogre's forest. Now they all feasted and drank and danced until early hours. Her father, who had greeted the knight's arrival dourly, expecting little from one who had won his spurs only days before, spoke with him as he sat in the seat of honor at the edge of the village green. "I doubted you, young sir," he said. "I had no faith. You had faith. That's where we differ. Oh, I am no heathen. I attend Mass every year, but when the ogre forced us to offer up our maidens, I could see no hope of salvation. Yet after years of drudgery, never knowing whether it would be feast or famine when harvest came, my faith was all spent." He patted the knight on the arm. "You believed. You had faith in yourself, and it led you to victory. Yet a word of wisdom from an old man? Sometimes faith isn't enough." The knight smiled at him absently. "Faith means little without deeds," he said, remembering what an old man-at-arms in his foster-father's castle had told him. The girl appeared from the green where the youths and maidens of the village had been amusing themselves with dancing. She seemed fully recovered from her previous fear, and she gave the knight a bold, appraising glance. "Father," she said, "you don't mean to bore my hero all night, do you?" He looked sternly down at her impudent face and laughing eyes, then his weather-beaten features cracked open into a smile. "The least you owe the knight is to dance with him," he said. "Go, daughter, with my blessing." She reached out a long, slim hand to help the knight out of his seat, and led him at a run towards the green, laughing as she went. "I'm glad you took off all that armor," she said. "You wouldn't be much good at dancing dressed like that." He was about to say that he had fought well enough in his armor, and surely dancing would be no less taxing. But then the musicians struck up a new tune, and he and the girl found themselves amidst a laughing, dancing crowd. Soon the knight learnt that dancing and other amusements could be at least as tiring as warfare. They lay together among the bushes, his mighty arm around her slim shoulders, gazing into each other's eyes, breathless. Her face was flushed and content. She lifted a hand to play teasingly with his mustaches. "You saved me," she murmured. "You saved me, my knight, my prince." He kissed her. "My own fair damosel," he replied. "When I set out from my foster-father's castle, I had no lady's favors to tie upon my armor, and I thought it a great shame. But now I can wear your favors when I ride to the jousts, and out on errantry." She frowned a little and drew away from him. Looking out across the village beyond the bushes, she asked, "Don't you want to stay here?" He laughed awkwardly. I can't stay." Did she know nothing of the duties of a knight? She was little more than a peasant girl, though he wouldn't let that stand in the way of his love. Yet he was a knight. He had been trained to a life of war against the foes of Holy Mother Church. "I can't stay," he said again, after a silence. "I must become the finest knight in all Christendom." Again she made no reply, but stared out into the dark. He touched her arm, and she half looked at him, irritably. "Don't you want the love of the finest knight in all of Christendom?" She looked straight at him, her eyes troubled. "I just want you," she said, her voice low. Laughing, he drew her towards him. He buried his face in her long, silky, sweet-scented hair. She resisted him, turned her face away as he tried to kiss her again. "But I will be Christendom's finest knight!" he exclaimed. "Look at the start I've made. Dubbed a knight days before, and already I've saved a fair damosel. If I can build on that, by the time I'm 20, I will be renowned throughout every kingdom. Wouldn't you be proud to have such a man as your lover?" She leant her head against his chest and said weakly, "Don't go." Her fingers closed on the folds of his tunic, and she lifted a tear-streaked face. "It won't be for long," he said. With a sigh, she rested her head against his chest again. I'll win myself a castle," he went on, "and then I will return to claim your hand, and you can come and live with me in luxury and splendor. My every victory will be in your name. Wherever I go, maidens will swoon, but they will all know that I am dedicated to you, that I have forsworn the love of all maidens, except you." "Don't go," she said again, her voice muffled. "Don't go." The next morning he had his horse saddled and ready. The village folk had made him a shield to replace the one he'd lost fighting the ogre. The blacksmith had hammered out the dents in his armor, where he now wore the girl's kerchief as a favor. The girl's father stood by the horse's crupper as the knight swung himself up. The girl herself appeared from their hall. Her face was somber. "You're sure you intend to leave?" the girl's father was saying. "You'll be welcome to stay, but I realize we could never keep a knight in the style he expects." He noticed his daughter. "What's that long face for?" he teased. "Hasn't he said that he'll only be gone a year or two? As soon as he's won himself a castle, he'll come back for you. I'll be proud to give you away to a man such as him." "What if he never returns?" she asked dolefully. Her father laughed awkwardly and looked up at the knight who was watching from his horse. "Don't speak such ill-omened words, girl," he said. "You'll put a curse on his whole career, talking like that. Well, young sir, I hope we'll see you soon." The knight nodded. He beckoned to the girl, and she came slowly to his side. He leaned over to kiss her again, but she returned the kiss with little enthusiasm. Then he shook his reins, spurred his horse, and galloped off into the morning sun, leaving a trail of dust as he rode down the track leading into the forest. She watched him go in silence. Years passed. Part 2. The knight rode at full tilt through a ravaged land, desperation in his eyes. On every side smoke rose from burning villages. Corpses clogged the streams and dikes, or lay rotting in the fields, prey to kites and crows and ravens. Leagues behind him his comrades all lay dead on the field of battle, staring up at bleak skies with sightless eyes. They had been betrayed. Betrayed. The word burnt fiercely in his bitter mind. The Free Company had joined only months before, had been hired by a rebel count, a man with a claim to the throne. This rebel had unleashed an assault on the western counties and duchies of the kingdom, looting villages, pillaging abbeys, besieging royal castles. Soon all the West had declared its allegiance to him or suffered his wrath. The king raised his own armies. Civil war ravaged the lands, yet after the count secretly met the king to agree a settlement, his mercenary army became an embarrassment, and he had led them, unwitting, to a place where the king's men had ambushed them. Now the knight rode in fear and weariness, the last survivor. He had learnt the truth too late to save his comrades, but at least he had saved his own skin, as he had so many times over the years. He had careened from one squalid mercenary venture to another, turning to highway robbery when the pickings were few and times were hard. Much that he had done had been little to his honor, but he had seldom been given any choice. His youthful ambitions had faded into a dream of half-forgotten summer days, before the long, lonely, empty years of fighting for robber barons, guarding merchants, selling his axe to the highest bidder. Once he'd joined a crusade against a heretical barony in the hopes of winning enough plunder to purchase a castle, estates, and men-at-arms, only to learn that the heretics were ill-favored peasants who lived in a poverty that put shame to that professed by the church. They had been easy prey, but the profits had been small. He had known many women in his wanderings, harlots and camp followers, yet he had never forgotten the girl he'd saved. In that year of his youth, when everything had seemed possible, and the whole world had lain at his feet, he had worn her favors until they were rags. Never had he forgotten her, or that night when they had been together. He remembered that she had adored him, told him he would become the greatest knight in Christendom, urged him to ride out to win glory and honor in her name. He had never forgotten her, but he had never returned. He had considered it many times, told himself repeatedly that next year, when he had enough booty left over from the summer campaign and the never-ending carousing in winter quarters, he would ride back to find her. He had no castle, no lands, and little glory to brag of. Yet he had faith in her, knew that she still waited for him, that not a day had gone by when her thoughts had not turned to him. The memory of her had kept him going through those long, lonely, empty years. The memory of her love. Now he was alone, and an entire kingdom was at his heels. He had to find a bolt hole, somewhere where people would shelter him. He was a wanted man in many lands. Where could he find safety? That night, as he lay in his blankets, and his mare snorted and wheezed in the cold air, he considered his chances. Then it struck him. The notion kept him awake all night, and all that held him back from riding away through the dark was the knowledge that his mare needed rest. Yet he could find none himself. When a watery sun rose above the plain, he hastened to his steed, and hurriedly prepared for the journey. As far as he recalled, her village lay to the south and west beyond the mountains, a day's ride from the border with the land of the free cities. He no longer fully remembered the road, but he was confident that he could make his way through the maze of forest paths to her home. She would welcome him, and his enemies would never think to find him sheltering in an obscure backwoods hall, leagues from any court or city. Perhaps he could settle down with her, marry her, till the earth, and lead the easy life of a peasant. His fighting days were done. He had never gained the glory he sought, only wounds and foes. Perhaps a new life of humility and happiness awaited him. He found her finally, in the last tumble-down hut of the village. He had led his mare through the place, which seemed so small and mean and cramped, when in his memory it shone in the sun of a summer dawn. The villagers were sullen, suspicious of him. No one seemed to remember him. They pointed him to her hut. Her old hall had been burnt down during the wars, they told him. Then they watched him lead his mare down the street. He hitched his steed to a fence post and approached the hut. Dirty, semi-naked children were playing in the mud. A stout woman walked tiredly from a well, carrying a bucket of water. As he stood at the gate, she saw him and stopped still. The bucket dropped from her nerveless fingers to spill on the hard-packed earth, but she paid it no heed. Frowning uncertainly, he came closer. He saw a thick-set woman in early middle age, her face seamed, her hair graying. With a lump in his throat, he noticed fresh bruising round her eyes. Yet it was those eyes that he recognized. "I thought you were dead," she said at last. He said nothing, merely extended his arms in a gesture as if to say, "Here I am, alive." He looked at the squabbling children. "I waited," she said harshly. "I did wait. I waited a year and another year. I ate my heart out waiting. Then the wars came to this land. My father was killed defending his hall. The bloom of my youth was almost over when I met another man. A man who cared for me after my father's death, who gave me a roof over my head and children. He provides for me still." The knight looked uneasily at her black eyes. She touched them and shrugged. "I answer back too much, he says," she explained. "He has to teach me a lesson from time to time." She looked at him proudly, defiantly, daring him to comment. He turned his face away, as pity welled up in his heart, glistened in his eyes. "He's a good man," she insisted. "He drinks when he comes in from the fields, but he works long and hard in the sun. He provides for us." She indicated her children. "That's what matters. He doesn't own a castle, but he's there. Do you understand me?" He nodded his head silently, ashamed. All his hopes, his aspirations, had been founded on nothing. A lost dream, a memory of youth and of long, dark years of brooding and hoping. It had been the thought of her that had kept him going all that time, the thought that she was waiting for him, that she loved him, a hollow hope. I should have come back long ago, he said at last. I never got that castle. Sometimes I came close, but I suppose you found some high-born woman at least, she said. He shook his head in silence. Is there anything I can do for you? He asked, trying not to look critically at the filth and squalor of her home. He meant, was there any way he could regain her love, that love of a night, half a lifetime ago? She shook her head. There's no work for the likes of you here, she told him. You killed the last of the ogres. There are none left these days. He looked at the bruises on her face and wondered if that was true. Still, she added bitterly, you were always good with that axe. I need firewood. Why don't you go into the forest and cut me some? He spent most of that day cutting firewood. He was determined to do this as well as he could, to bring back enough fuel to keep her for a year. He would show her how much he loved her, if not by saving her from an ogre, then by providing for her. The sun was descending before he finally loaded up his mare with the firewood and started back toward the village. When he reached the hut, he heard the sound of raised voices. He came closer, heard her own high-pitched voice in the deeper boom of a man. Then he caught the sound of a slap, and his stomach lurched. He had seen men flogged to death for insubordination on the battlefield, but this was more than he could bear. He left his horse, crossed the yard hurriedly, pushed back the hide curtain, and stepped into the hut. She lay sprawled across the earthen floor on the far side. Her children cowered in the corners of the hut. A large, hairy, unwashed man in homespun stood over her, fists doubled. As the night entered, the man swung round. His face was flushed, dangerous. So this is the big man, he sneered. The old flame. He seized his wife by the hair and yanked her up. Is this him? I remember him when he was a young knight, when he came here. He's put on weight. Please don't, she murmured. He raised his hand to strike her again. The knight moved without thinking. His axe was in his hand. It flashed in the firelight. Children scampered out of his way. Blood sprayed into the air as the man's corpse fell to the earthen floor, dragging her down with it. She rose, shuddering, sobbing, staring in horrified disbelief at her husband's carcass. Then she rounded on him. "What have you done?" she shrieked. He was going to hit you," the knight exclaimed. He had saved her, hadn't he? He had saved her. Did that mean nothing? She gestured at the frightened children. "Who will look after them now?" she demanded. "Who will go and work in the fields now? He kept our bellies full. Who will do that now?" "I could do that," he began. "You?" she sneered. He saw the hatred in her eyes, the anger. "You? What could you do? All you could ever do was kill. Get out! Get out!" Barely comprehending, he stumbled from the hut. The sun was setting over the forest. Finding his horse, cropping the grass nearby, he flung down the firewood by her gate, then mounted. Everything he had believed in had been based on a lie, a hollow dream, an illusion. He had saved her from the ogre when they had been young, yet he could not save her from the ogre he had become. He spurred his horse and rode towards the forest.
And as promised, I'd like to talk about the Infect Scranton Zombie Convention I went to with my daughter a couple of weeks ago, back in September in Scranton, Pennsylvania. It was a great zombie convention, had a great apocalyptic feel, had a paintball survival tournament through the back mountains of the ski resort at Montage Mountain. Just great people, great outlet, great atmosphere. A lot of movie people were there from the Walking Dead cast, a few of the second bit players, cast members from Walking Dead, some of the cast from Dawn of the Dead, the original one, such as Jim Crut, the helicopter zombie, the nurse zombie, Mike Christopher, the Hare Krishna zombie, and the machete zombie were also there. They were so super friendly, so professional. I shared a table right across from them with my daughter to sell my books. which are available everywhere books are sold, from Jeremiah Black to Contagion to Ghost Prince to my short story collection Demon Revolver, all available. If you really like the horror genre, different mix of horror that I offer. And we just talk shop with Jim and the cast there about movies, The Dawn of the Dead, Mr. George Romero, who I met at one of the conventions in Gettysburg at Horror Find, who is also an awesome guy to talk to and just ask questions and shoot the breeze with. The Walking Dead cast kind of had a little bit of a crowd, didn't get quite over there to talk to them as I was manning my own table, but I met a bunch of great authors from Jacqueline Druga to Scott Baker to Kim Paffrenoth, the Gospel of the Dead author, Bram Stoker winning author of Gospel of the Dead. They were all into zombies as well, both him and Mr. Baker. Jacqueline does a lot of publishing as well. She has a nice library set up. And then we're just pretty much just hanging around doing an author panel with other authors such as Kirk Almond, who is big in the zombie genre, Nick Casella, who wrote Morning Stars by Black Bedsheet Books, which I'm also part of with Jeremiah Black. And Jacqueline, Scott, and Kim also joined us on the author panel. And we just answered a bunch of questions about writing, publishing, how we come up with our characters and plot lines, how we react to negative criticism, positive feedback, what our readers want, what they don't like, what they do like. We are all headed professionally. For me, I'm currently working on a shark novel that I'm pushing around to publishers, as well as a bunch of short stories. My novel Contagion, available through Horrified Press. 2 of my short stories also through Horrified Press in the Suffer Eternal Volume 3 anthology, now out everywhere. And I also have Read Us or Die, an anthology I edited through Black Bedsheet Books that features a bunch of the authors from that publishing house, as well as my own work as well. That's available everywhere books are sold, Amazon, Nook, Kindle. Feel free to check it out anywhere. So the zombie convention was awesome. I would definitely go back next year. It was my first time there. Everybody was very friendly, professional, courteous. They went out of the way to make sure all the guests were taken care of. A really nice time. So if you get a chance to go to Infect Zombie Convention, Infect Scranton Zombie Convention in 2014, if they're so fortunate to have it, which I think they will, stop by. I'll probably be there. We'll chat, and they'll have other venues for you to do some tattoos, some face paint, FX work. I mean, everything was there. It was all really awesome stuff. So until next week, I'm Jason Gehlert on the Dark Dreams podcast. I'd like to thank Mr. E.S. Wynn for narrating our stories tonight, Mr. Mark Slade for putting it all together, and our authors, Gavin Chappell for The Last of the Ogres, and Jay Noyes Share for Blip Hunter, that awesome filmmaker from New York who was so awesome and fortunate to break into that busy and competitive field. I'd like to thank him for sharing that awesome story with us. So once again, thank you, and good night.
We'll be right back.